Guitar Business Radio is the podcast for the business of guitar, where you'll always get no reviews, no demos, and no idle chatter. From players to CEOs and in between. If you have a professional or business connection to the world of guitar, this show is your window to insight and information you won't get anywhere else. I'm Jeffrey D. Brown, and I approve this message. So let's get to it. From Guitar Business Media, welcome to the 59th episode of GBR. And today, we'll spend the full hour talking to the very well-known guitar and bass builder, Roger Sadowski. It's an in-depth interview, and Roger talks to us in great detail about his business that spans over 4 decades. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, as usual, a very brief plug for our latest episode of our alter ego podcast, GBR Focus. And in this brand new episode, we're talking to John Moody of GHS Strings, and we're focused on their acoustic line of strings. At the same time, John reveals a major new product announcement from GHS, and you can listen to that when you get finished here, of course, at, you know what I'm going to say, gbrfocus.com. Also, don't forget to join me after the interview today in the back of the show, where we always offer you our interview wrap-up, as well as extraordinarily useful commentary you will not get anywhere else. I can promise you that. In fact, if you are or were a Seinfeld fan, you'll especially want to listen to the back of the show today. And while you're sitting there or driving, running, or walking in anticipation of the back of the show, we'll just move right along to something completely different. Well, my guest on GBR today is Roger Sadowski. For over 40 years, he's been building basses and guitars in New York, working with top-name players from around the world. He initially built a very strong reputation and following for his innovative repair and modification work, but has been making his own high-quality instruments since the early 80s. And today, the Sadowski brand is highly regarded. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get to it, as Roger Sadowski joins us right here and right now. Hey, Roger, thanks so much for taking time to come on the show with us, and welcome to GBR.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I know we've been trying to make this work out for quite a while, and finally we made the connection. So let's kind of do what we always do in the beginning of the show, which is start with a little historical picture and find out what things in your youth had maybe the greatest influence on how you got to where you are today. So what can you tell us about that? Okay.
Well, first thing I can tell you is that I didn't grow up with a family of craftsmen or people who work with their hands. My father was a CPA and my mother was a secretary. And I didn't even build models when I was a kid. It was a pretty typical family where education was everything, and my mother wanted me and my brothers to be doctors. So I actually got as far as getting halfway to a PhD in psychobiology at Rutgers University before I decided to start building guitars. The relevant history is I fell in love with guitars at the end of my junior year in college, in that I went to a folk festival that the college had held. And it was my first exposure to hippies and banjos and folk music. And it was an experience that really resonated for me. And I really felt at home with the people who were there and the music and the instruments. So the next week, my friend took me to Rochester, New York to buy my first guitar, which was a $40 Aria nylon string guitar. And I started teaching myself how to finger pick, and I was listening to Gordon Lightfoot and Simon and Garfunkel. And so that's where my guitar infatuation began. And in graduate school, I was actually quite miserable for the most of my 2 years there.
Yeah, I can understand that, I guess.
The more miserable I was, the more time I spent hanging out with guitar people and taking guitar lessons. And I got in with a group of basically professional folk musicians at the time. And I just got obsessed with, they had all these fabulous old vintage Martins. I got really obsessed with the instrument. And I just had this very romanticized fantasy that if I learned to build guitars, that I could get out of the rat race and have my cabin in the woods, and musicians would beat a path to my door.
And you would not be a doctor.
Right? Being in Manhattan, not a cabin in the woods.
Yeah.
But that's where it all started. And so I eventually quit graduate school and took a job at a local music store in New Jersey. And they were selling these handmade acoustic guitars by a builder named Liprinzi, who happened to be in near Lambertville, New Jersey. And I got myself down there, and I said to him that his first name was Augie Liprinzi. And I remember saying to him that I felt that if I could implant an electrode in the lateral hypothalamus of a rat's brain, that I thought I could build a guitar. He had no idea what I was talking about, but he gave me a job. And so I was living the dream. I was living in the country, and I grew my hair long. I had a ponytail, and I was a hippie building guitars, and I couldn't have been happier.
So that was, and did you get paid for that?
Yeah, I did get paid. It wasn't an apprenticeship. I got paid $80 a week and took home 60.
Yeah, well, then you couldn't live on that today. But so that's kind of how you got started in the business part of it, sort of. And how did it progress from there?
So I spent about 2 years with Augie learning really the basics of how to make flat top acoustic guitars. I learned a lot about business from Augie, more in the sense of what not to do than what to do. I love Augie to death, and if he's still living, and I love him dearly, but he wasn't the best businessman in the world, and I did learn a lot from what I perceived to be his mistakes. And then I moved on to a music instrument store outside of Philly called Medley Music, which was located in Bryn Mawr. And I took over their repair department, which had kind of fallen into disarray after the previous guy moved on. And I turned it into a first-class repair facility, and that's where I really started to gain my reputation over my 5 years there. Yeah. And there was a top player, a session guy in Philly named Craig Snyder. And he moved to New York in '77 and got right into the session scene in New York. And he kept bringing his guitars to me to repair. And I said to him, Craig, there's got to be better people than me in New York City. And he said, no, there weren't. And he even started bringing his friends' guitars down to me to work on. Nice. Yeah. So I got into a routine of driving up to New York every weekend, and I'd work out of his apartment. His friends would bring their guitars or basses over. I'd do the simple stuff there, and I would take the bigger stuff back to Philly for the week, and then bring it back the following weekend.
So would you take like a doctor's bag of tools or something along with it?
Exactly. I'd bring up all my setup tools, and after doing that for 6 months and connecting with a lot of top session guys in New York, I had enough confidence to just make the move and set up a shop and hang a shingle.
And that's how it got started. That was about the end of the 70s, right?
That was 1979, fall of 1979.
So that kind of gets me to where I wanted to be right now and ask you a couple of questions like, at what point did you actually feel like you had some traction? And then I'd like to hear about some of the significant milestones for the company, as well as any challenges that you had to overcome. So it's a broad question, but
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, let me start by saying that when I decided to go on my own, I felt that if I was going to make a living at this, I needed to be where the top players were.
That makes sense.
Who could afford to pay me what I felt I needed to make a living, and with the confidence that I already had, that I pretty much knew what I was doing. And so those choices at that time were New York, Los Angeles, or Nashville. And for me, as a native-born New Yorker, New York was the logical place for me to go. So that's why I ended up in New York. But the point I'm trying to make is I think to grow in this craft, the more you can surround yourself with full-time working professional musicians who can give you the kind of feedback of what their needs are on a daily basis and the problems they deal with in a studio or live, that's the way you grow in your craft. And, it could be much easier financially to locate yourself in the boonies where it's really cheap, but without that interaction with top players, you just can't grow the way I was.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So you were doing primarily repair work at that time.
Yeah,
right?
At that time, the scene, look, my first passion was making flat tops. And there's nothing I would have loved to have done more than that. But you literally could not sell a handmade flat top guitar in those days. It was Guild, Gibson, Martin, and that was it. There were a couple. Gallagher was around. Mossman was still around. Gurion was there. But for the most part, smaller boutique acoustic guitar maker didn't exist yet. And there wasn't a receptive customer for that. So I was heavily into repair and modification, especially working on all these great instruments that these studio players had, that really they had great bones, but they had been seriously neglected, and so a lot of my early work was spent modifying and upgrading the instruments these guys already were playing on. I made my first solid body guitar around 1980, and I quickly found receptive people, local people, to buy those. And I made my first bass in 1982. Right. And, but I never, I think you're aware, Jeff, I'm primarily known for basses, but I never set out to be a bass maker. It was just the way this is the old expression, you ride the horse in the direction it's going. And a lot of my work was really, really well received by bass players.
Well, it's funny because way back when I remember, and I can't even tell you when it was, but the first I got to know of you was really for the electric nylon string guitar.
Okay.
That kind of caught my eye, and so that was what for a long time I kind of associated with you, not really in those days knowing that that there was a lot of other stuff going on.
So let me explain how that guitar came about, because I think it's relevant to our conversation. Yeah. So all throughout the 80s, I'm working with these studio guys, and a lot of them had the Gibson Chet Atkins nylon guitar, which had come out in the 80s. And they were bringing them to me because they didn't intonate well, or they didn't like the sound of the low E string, or they found the guitar too heavy. And I just said to myself, I think I can do this better. And so I actually made my first attempt at making that type of instrument in 1990. I finished the first one. And at that time, we used to do a lot of work for the Stones before they'd go out on a tour. They would run about 30 instruments through our shop for setups and repair work before they hit the road. And Pierre de Beauport, who was the guitar tech and later their production manager, came to the shop and asked me for my advice that Keith Richards needed a nylon string that he could play in a big arena without feedback. And so I whipped out this electric nylon string, which I had literally just finished a few weeks earlier. And I said, well, why don't you take this and let Keith try it? And Keith loved it, and he bought that one and ordered a second one as a backup for the tour. And shortly after that, Lee Ritenour got one, and then the Brazilian guys like Gilberto Gil and Javon were ordering them. And so that guitar took off and became a success, and I still make virtually the same instrument today. I mean, I've certainly refined it over the years, but we still make that same guitar today.
Now, was that, just for my own edification, did that have any real significance or give you any kind of a boost at that time, or were people just still seeing you as building these other instruments? No,
that gave a huge boost. The single most thing, let's back up about 10 years, the single most thing that put me on the map was the modification work I did on Marcus Miller's 1977 jazz bass in 1979. My friend Craig Snyder, who I told you was the one who encouraged me to come to New York, he brought Marcus to the shop one day. Marcus, I think, was 17 and just starting to do some jingles in the studio scene. And I remember Marcus just gave me his bass, his classic 77 natural maple fingerboard jazz bass, and said, make this the best bass you possibly can. And I had just done my first active electronic installation on another customer's bass, which gave the bass an active treble and bass boost control. And the feedback I had gotten from this player, his name was Tony Kniff, he's still around and playing in New York, was just how much better his bass cut through both live and in the studio, and that bass players were often having trouble sitting in a mix where they weren't obscured by the kick drum. And the addition of this active tone circuit seemed to be a bit of a magic bullet for enabling these bass players to cut through. And so I suggested to Marcus that we do that, as well as a good fret job and upgrade the hardware, put a better bridge on. I installed a badass bridge. And that mod, and over the next 10 years, Marcus, really became huge as a bass player and later on as a producer and with Miles Davis. In Japan, when Marcus went to Japan, it was like the Beatles going to Japan. And that single bass mod, I think, put me on people's radar more than anything else.
And how did that manifest? How did your name get out there into the public square?
Well, it was through the magazines at the time, Guitar Player magazine primarily, and then just a whole lot of word of mouth. Yeah. I mean, there was no internet then,
right?
And I had no budget for any kind of advertising. It was literally all word of mouth.
Yeah, but the word was that you were the one to.
I was the guy.
Yeah. So.
I should also say the second to that was my relationship with Will Lee, also one of the top bassists on the planet. And Will was also, I started playing, besides all the work I did on his instruments, he started playing my instruments early on. And so for 32 years on the Letterman show, people were seeing Will play my bass every night.
Yeah.
And I can even remember back in the 80s, people would come in and they would comment to me, how amazing my bass sounded on TV on the Letterman show. And, this was when the speaker in a TV was about 2 inches in diameter.
Yeah, that's right.
And there was only one.
Yeah.
And people were already able to hear the difference or how well the bass cut through just from that.
So I always like to find out a little bit about, the challenges, because we all learn from those things. Was there anything in, say, those first 10 or 15 years or so that you would kind of classify as a challenge that you had to deal with in any way?
I would say, especially given the topic of your podcast, the biggest challenge was how do you amortize your overhead and pay yourself a living wage as a one-man business in New York? And I've discovered that it was impossible. And so that's why I, in a dream world, I would have been a one-man shop for my entire life. But I realized that I needed some extra help in the shop to help generate additional income to be able to cover the kind of overhead I had. Yeah. And I mean, I'm talking when I was paying $400 a month for my shop space. Okay. But basically, my first space, I took a 1,000 square foot loft that was $800 a month, and I put a wall up in the middle, and I lived on one side and I worked on the other. And I did that for the first 7 years that I was in business. Yeah,
that's a common story. And in some respects, I mean, that's what you got to do. And there's nothing wrong with that, huh?
Exactly. So in that space, one extra employee was sufficient. And probably the best employee I brought on was J.W. Black, who after I knew him from my Philly days. And he's as a player, and he moved out to Kansas City, I believe, and started doing guitar repair out there. And in '84, I got called in to build some instruments for Prince. I ended up building 6 for him. But the first 2 had to be done relatively quickly. And I called Jay and I said, could you come out for a couple of weeks and give me a hand with this? And we got along incredibly well, and his skill set was excellent. And so after that, I offered him a full-time job, and he came to work for me in the fall of '85 and worked with me through '89. And after me, he moved on to become a master builder at the Fender Custom Shop.
Okay. Yeah, we've had a couple of those guys on. I think we had Paige and my other friend Mike Stevens.
John Page and John Sir. At the Custom Shop.
Yeah. So that gets you into the '90s, and it's been a long time. It's been 4 decades now that you've been kind of at this. Where does it, at what point, were there any major shifts along the way? We had the '90s and you get into we had some economic things. Was there any point there where you had to shift around and figure out where to go next?
The first thing I noticed was in late '85, early '86, and that was the studio scene in New York started to change. And the first thing that happened was bass players weren't getting called for jingle work because their work was starting to be done by synthesizers. And so that was the first sign that something was starting to change, because in those days, you had your A-call studio guys and your B-call studio guys. And when the jingle business was huge at that time, and the B guys were called in to do the demos that you pitched to the client, and then the A guys were called in to do the final. Yeah. And so at that time, B guys could make a living, and the A guys were probably getting called for 20 jingle dates a week. Wow. And if these were national spots, they were getting royalties every 13 weeks. That spot renewed, they'd get renewed for another round of royalties. And they were making a lot of money in those days. And but all of a sudden, things were starting to get written on synthesizer, and the bass couldn't go low enough, and which is one of the things that contributed to the development of the 5-string bass. But at that time, it was just they were out of work. And then before long, the whole advertising business was changing. And so all these fabulous guitar players, and bass players, unless they moved into setting up their own little production studios, there was no way they were going to be able to continue make a living in music. And at least in that session scene. And it was really, by the end of the 80s, it was almost gone already. That's how quickly that scene collapsed. So you had the radical shift and bands switched from bands started to become self-contained bands. I mean, these guys were making a lot of money in sessions, like doing albums for Donna Summers and those kinds of things. And as music changed, it moved much more into self-contained bands. So session guys just weren't needed like they used to be.
Yeah.
So all of that I felt directly. And that's when I made my first move. I moved my shop closer to 48th Street, where all the music stores were. I was not on 48th Street. I was around the corner. I had a spot in a building on the 10th floor on Broadway between 48th and 49th Street. So at least I got closer to where there was street traffic and a lot of, let's say, non-professional musicians or traveling musicians who could easily get access to my shop.
Was there easy access to get to? I mean, you weren't on the street or anything like that.
No, but again, it was word of mouth still, and people just were able to find me. I had great relationships with Manny's on 48th Street, and they would send everybody to me. They even took in Mick Jagger's flat top and called me to come in and get it and work on it. And so I had a good relationship with Manny's, and that was very helpful as well.
So you were doing, so I get a sense of the timeline. You did all this repair work and mod work and that sort of thing. How long did you continue to do that?
I tried to maintain a 50-50 balance of that work and my own instruments until about 2002.
Okay.
And I just, first of all, I felt it was good not to have all your eggs in one basket.
Sure.
And the repair work brought in a lot of people who would be potential customers to buy one of my instruments.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It made a lot of sense. What happened in 2002, and part of the story of my life being in New York, is pretty much any time a lease was up, I had to move my shop because I couldn't afford the rent increase at the end of the lease. Yeah. And so I've had 4 shops in 40 years.
Well, it's once every decade then, I guess.
Pretty much. And so we moved from Manhattan. We finally got priced out of Manhattan in 2002, and I moved to an up-and-coming neighborhood in Brooklyn, which is called Dumbo, which stands for Down Under Manhattan Bridge Overpass.
Oh, I've heard that.
It's right where the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge meet in Brooklyn, and that neighborhood. And so at that time, a lot of my veteran staff from my Broadway shop had moved on. And I can teach a new person to be pretty competent in our instrument making in about a year. But to be a competent repair person takes years of experience working on a lot of instruments. And as a result, all the repair work was falling on me. And I couldn't manage all the repair work and manage the rest of the workshop at the same time. So at that time, I made the decision to just limit repairs to my own instruments.
Right. And at that time, how would you describe the production capacity for your own instruments? How much were you doing at that point? How many guitars?
Okay. So I just want to make it clear that I never wanted to have a factory. I never wanted to be that big.
Sure.
One of the things that had been with me from the beginning was this very strong desire to want to deal directly with the musicians as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And I kind of had an epiphany in the early 80s that as much as I love the process of making guitars, they can't love me back, okay? They're inanimate objects. And this real satisfaction came from my interaction with the people playing my instruments. And so that was a very strong factor that made me want to kind of limit the size of my business to a level where I could deal directly with my players and not just be selling to buyers of music stores. I never wanted to get to that level. And I always wanted to stay out of the mainstream of the biz, of the big companies and the NAMM shows and all of that kind of stuff. That's not where my interests lay.
So how does that correspond to what you were doing? I mean, you've obviously grown over the years and you have a much larger catalog, I would say, and I don't have a frame of reference of where you were at that point versus where you are today. So
at that point, I would say at my Broadway shop with 5 guys, I think we hit a maximum of about 10 instruments a month we were making.
Okay, well, that's not bad. It was 100, 120 a year. So that was
and then at the Brooklyn shop, we probably got up at our peak. Let's see, we had maybe six or seven people in the Brooklyn shop, one person being like a shipping manager and one person being an office manager, and then maybe 6 of us in the workshop. And we probably got up to about 20 to 25 a month. And in my current shop in Long Island City, now we've been consistently doing 35 to 38 a month.
Yeah, so that still puts you in, I don't know if that's boutique business, but it's somewhere between that and small manufacturer.
Exactly. I'm right in the middle there, you know. And for me, it's a strange term, the boutique guitar business, but a lot of those builders tend to be, 1, 2, and 3 man type shops.
Yep.
And but again, due to my overhead needs, I've always added people as we've grown so that I can, not only increase our production a little bit, but every move also meant a significant rent increase and recouping the cost of financing.
Means you had to sell more. You have to sell more stuff, basically.
Yeah.
So that gives us a pretty good background on how things have developed. Let's talk a little bit about the business today and in terms of how you see Sadowski Guitars, how you differentiate from the others. You must have a sense of that from your own perspective.
Yeah. Again, part of how I differentiate what we do is again, the size of our business, the size of our production. I mean, a customer will call our shop and, I want to have the conversation with them to make sure that what they're ordering is what I may think is the best choice of the things that we can offer them.
Right.
All right. So definitely want to have that one-on-one interaction. I'm going to back up a minute and say I think one of the most significant things that changed my business and changed everything was the internet.
Oh, sure, I would think.
I remember going to the very first NAMM show in Nashville about 25 years ago, and a customer of mine came up to me and said, "Roger, I don't care if you don't do anything with it. I want you to register your domain name tomorrow." So I didn't even know what a domain name was. Okay. So I did that. And then, so then I said, all right, I have this thing. What do I do with it? And the next step was to make a website. And the great guitarist, Joe Beck, had a space in the building I had at the Broadway shop, and he was actually doing websites at that time in addition to playing guitar. So Joe Beck put my first website together for me.
Wow, that's a story.
And I had the realization at that time, I used to basically just keep a few of my instruments on the wall as demos and build everything to order. And once the internet occurred and I had a website, I realized that there were two very different kinds of buyers, consumers. There was the guy who kind of knew what he wanted and wanted it built to his specs and was willing to wait 6 months or 8 months or 10 months. And then there was another guy who needed something now. And if I didn't have what he wanted, he was going somewhere else.
Sure.
And so I made the decision at that time that I would start devoting a percentage of my production to building instruments for my own inventory. And we created a page on the website of instruments in stock for immediate sale. And I think that without that, I probably wouldn't still be in business today. So the internet combined with having instruments in stock for immediate sale made a tremendous difference in my business.
And that you would say that you probably, well, from what you were describing, I mean, I started kind of getting into that in the later part of the 90s. And
yeah, that's about right.
You know,
it was
so
later 90s.
Yeah, and then we had sort of the bust of Web 1.0, and then it was it took a little while as we got into the 2002, 3 things started. We started to kind of get this Web 2.0 thing, and I was actually like Joe Beck. I was started building sites because I'd been in the agency business for years and sort of kind of got into it early. And there was a real change, a kind of a reinvigoration, as we all kind of remember, in the early part of the 2000s after the 9/11 thing. And I think I kind of remember back 2003 or so, things started to change a little bit. And do you have are there any milestones along the way where you saw significant changes as a result of the internet along the way?
Well, absolutely. It's what enabled me to reach a much larger audience and enabled me to basically make the decision to have a larger shop and to focus on my instruments as opposed to the repair work. I can think of one previous event that was almost as life-changing as the internet, and that was in 1987 when I got my first fax machine.
Oh, yeah.
And
right.
Having a fax machine instantly made you an international business. And all of a sudden, I was able to deal with customers in Hong Kong and in Europe. And so, yeah, I'd say fax machine followed by the internet were the two biggest technological milestones that dramatically affected my ability to do business.
So getting back to my question a little bit and trying to understand how you differentiate, how you see Sadowski guitars as being different. I mean, it's everybody's got a different picture of that, and sometimes it's a real narrow thing, and sometimes it's a wider thing. But do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the things, again, that differentiates me is staying at a smaller size, dealing direct as much as possible, and the fact that you can't reinvent the wheel every year at the NAMM show by throwing out all these new models that really don't have anything to offer over what you were previously doing. Mm-hmm. So I've always built in a Fender style, and some people have criticized me for that, for not being more original or whatever. And I'd like to put that into some perspective. Back in the early 80s, the union directory for the 802 Musicians Union in New York had two chapters for bass. One was acoustic bass, and the other was Fender bass.
Fender bass, that's right.
There was no other electric bass.
Yeah, it was Fender bass.
In the studio.
You used to see credits that would say Bill Smith on Fender bass.
Right. And you couldn't walk into a recording session with anything but a Fender bass because, a jingle session took about 40 minutes. An engineer was not going to spend 10 minutes trying to dial in the sound of a bass he hadn't recorded before. And you can be sure you wouldn't have been asked back by that studio or that producer or that arranger if you did walk in with anything but a Fender bass. Yeah. So there was very strong pressure for me to gain acceptance in the real world of recording studios by making a bass that would essentially look like a Fender but sound really, really, really great. Okay. Yeah. So that was why one of the reasons I built in a Fender style. Number two was the fact that I found Fender's always much more easy to modify and hot rod and improve as opposed to Gibson's, where it was really hard to take a 335 and make it better than it was, other than a very minor change of hardware or of a bridge or tuning machines or new nut. But there was a lot you could do to modify and hot rod Stratocasters and Telecasters and jazz basses. So that's why my instruments are very Fender-like in their inspiration. I feel I've taken that design to a whole nother level. But the bottom line is Leo Fender got an awful lot right the first time around. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't a musician. And he surrounded himself with some good players, but he just really hit the nail on the head 95% of the time. And so for me, it was just a great honor to be able to take that platform and take it to the next level.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you've developed a great reputation and you have a following, and there's something about playing a Sadowsky bass that means something, I would imagine.
Yeah, and look, I get emails every day that literally just put a big smile on my face, and it's just wonderful to have had 40 years of basically making a difference in people's lives through my work. And I take all of this stuff very seriously. I never think in terms of number of units or containers, or I never had a bean counter working for me. It's always been a very personalized relationship that I've had with my customers.
Let me, since we're, this is Guitar Business Radio, we have a very broad audience and, a lot of people listen for a lot of different reasons, but let me just ask you a little bit about marketing.
Absolutely.
I would like to ask you, for instance, what marketing for Sadowsky guitars looks like today versus what it looked like 10 or 20 years ago. How has that changed, and how does that work for you today?
Well, in the beginning, I think one of the things I consciously did to establish my name and my reputation is I started writing for the guitar magazines. Mm-hmm. And I wrote one of my early articles back in the very early 80s, was called Zen and the Art of Guitar Repair. I became a reviewer for Guitar Player magazine, doing instrument, product reviews for them. Right. So I spent a lot of time in those earlier days writing for the magazines to establish my name, establish my reputation. I remember when I've had some budget, Hap Kuffner is a guy that you may know his name. He started off as one of the partners of Mandolin Brothers, and he was a partner starting Steinberger, mm-hmm. and he was head of international sales for EMG and PRS. And he gave me some sage advice many years ago. He said, start with a small ad, but put it in every issue. Have it present regularly, even if it's the smallest ad you can buy in the magazine. And that's what I started doing. So I started having small ads every week in Guitar Player, and then later on in Bass Player. And so that was the main form of marketing at that time, the small ads, the big involvement with the magazines. And then obviously the internet, when that came along, created a whole new avenue for marketing. Although I have to say, I was very, very slow to embrace Facebook as a form of marketing.
Yeah.
But we did that starting about 10 years ago. And I would say today, Facebook and Instagram is our major form of marketing. As it is for many companies, but you touched on something that really is, I think, also relevant today. I spent many years as a magazine publisher, and I've talked a little bit about that. And I recall having some big advertisers or people that had a lot of money, let's put it that way, that would want to come in and throw down $30,000 for a big spread ad one time. And, we'd kind of have to sit down and say, I'd be happy to take the 30,000, but let's just take that and spread it out and do a little smaller ad and run it multiple times. You're going to get a better response. You need the repetition. People one time are just not everybody's going to see it. Many people are not. So you had the right idea, and I'm assuming that had some positive effect. Absolutely, without a doubt. Yeah. So today, you're saying that it's mostly social media. Any advertising at all? Any traditional ads? I advertise in Bass Player magazine. I advertise in Guitar Player magazine. I advertise in Fretboard Journal. Mm-hmm. I advertise. Now, I don't do full page ads. I do quarter page typically. I've now, in Guitar Player and Bass Player, moved up to a half page every other month. Right. So I do 6 half pages a year in Bass Player, 6 half pages a year in Guitar Player. And I was never attracted to online advertising. Banner ads never impressed me because I would look at how many times I would go to various sites, and you'd never see the same banner ad twice. No, they're rotating them out. Yeah, so you're paying $450 a month for X number of clicks, and the reality is you probably never click on that website and see your own ad. Yeah. And so I always felt I'd rather put that money towards a magazine ad instead. And I also felt that I would say most of my customers are old enough that I still think they probably read magazines more than internet stuff. But that there's a lot of those magazines, of course, are digital now, and you can still pay to subscribe to a magazine. A lot of them have had to go to the free distribution part. And I hope you won't take this out, but I think most guys are reading those magazines when they're in the bathroom. Okay. Yeah, I don't need to take that out. I mean, I think that's a perfectly logical. And I think the attention span required to read stuff on a computer screen, for me, I can't do it. It's totally different. Yeah, it's a different experience. And I think we have to now I'm having the issue that a lot of these online musical instrument platforms are moving to video interviews. And I just don't think most people don't have more than a 5-minute attention span. And these interviews are going on for like 15, 20 minutes. Yeah. So that's why we do audio here, because I know a lot of people tell me they listen in their shop or they can drive and listen to it. It's totally different. I'm a radio guy. The audio thing is totally different. but even I don't have trouble sticking out a 10-minute video interview on a website. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we post any video content on YouTube for ourselves, we'll break it up into 5-minute segments of part 1, part 2, and part 3, and because I think it's hard to sit through a 10 or 15-minute interview on a computer.
Yeah. So internally, your marketing work is handled primarily by you, or do you have somebody else that's...
Yeah, primarily by me. Yeah. I have one guy now, a great guy who works with us part-time, who used to manage the website for a large company. And so he does a lot of our social media. Mm-hmm. But I still am the creative juice behind the magazine ads, and we have another guy in the shop who's fabulous at Photoshop. So I just sit down with him. I put a folder of photos together, and I say, let's do this, and we just do it all in house. I certainly don't have the budget to pay someone else to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's understandable. So let's shift the view a little bit, and I want to kind of get your perspective, shall we say, because that's kind of where we get to in this part of the show, and ask you about looking at the industry as a whole, kind of going forward. Do you have an opinion on where and if the opportunities exist, and where the challenges or pitfalls or speed bumps might be?
Yeah. I'll tell you right away, I don't have a very optimistic view of the future. You have a situation where, again, there's first of all, it's virtually impossible to make a living as a musician today. There's almost no session work, no studio work. Even the club date bands have been decimated by the DJs. The guys who do the weddings and the bar mitzvahs and the corporate gigs, they've been incredibly hammered the last 20 years from the DJs and recorded music. You're always seeing musicians post their checks from Spotify on Facebook, where after 200,000 plays, they're getting a check for $7. Yeah. And so I don't have a positive or encouraging view about the music business per se, and the musical instrument business is obviously totally dependent on the music business. It's been a long time since we've had anyone like the Beatles to get kids really excited. Probably the most relevant performer in that regard was probably Taylor Swift, and not only and getting a lot of women and girls engaged in playing guitars. And the other fact is that today you can buy for $500 a relatively good instrument compared to what you could buy 20, 30, 40 years ago. So there's a lot of decent stuff at lower price points and also the higher end part of the biz it's gotten pretty saturated. There are a lot of builders out there now, and I honestly don't know how any of these guys are making a living. And then there's also the guitar schools, and so kids are, their parents are spending a fair amount of money for them to go to guitar school for 6 months and learn how to do repair work and learn how to build guitars. But what are the opportunities when you get out of there? Okay. Yeah. So everyone who's ever approached me about getting into the work, getting into the craft, I've always recommended that they approach it as an avocation. It makes a fabulous hobby to have a little workshop in your basement, your garage, and build guitars, but it's a hell of a way to try to make a living. So that's pretty much the route that I try to steer people. Now, given that, And this goes back to your second interview, because I was listening to Pat Wilkins' interview with you the other night. And even Pat was saying it. If you're sufficiently passionate, you're going to do it no matter what. You know, and that applies to any art form, photography, music. I mean, you name it. If you are sufficiently passionate, you will find a way to make this your life. But it's not going to be easy. And it would be really, really nice if you had a trust fund.
Yeah. Well, I've been looking for that trust fund for a while, and I still can't find it.
And even back in the 70s, I was getting discouraged because I started to meet really interesting craftsmen, furniture makers, harpsichord makers, other guitar makers. And I did discover that a lot of these guys were independently wealthy, and that's what enabled them to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's so true. I've seen that also. Well, I guess I have one final question, and this is pretty much my standard closer. And I always like to ask, what does the future hold for Roger Sadowski, both personally and for the businessman?
Well, what the future holds for me is I never want to retire. I love my work. And I don't play golf. I don't love Florida. I can't think of anything I want to do more than make guitars. And so I think at the most, and I also want to stay living in New York. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. There's no other place in the world I would rather be. So moving to Arizona or Florida or any of those things that a lot of people who are thinking about retiring may want to do. I want to ride the subway till I die, and I want to die at my workbench. Wow. And so I think the only thing I would like to do is I will have to relocate my current shop at some point
for the fifth decade, probably, right?
Yeah, probably for the fifth decade. And I think at most I might like to just downsize a little bit and try and take off a little bit of the constant pressure, but I'm in this till the end of days.
And presumably, we'll just assume that that's going to be many, many days down the road. And,
I certainly hope so.
Well, Roger, I got to say, this has been a really enlightening and enriching hour for us, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to come on. I look forward to speaking with you again and comparing notes and see how things have changed, but it sounds to me like you're on a pretty good path.
Well, thank you. And again, I've been in love with my work for 47 years, and I consider myself a very, very fortunate guy that I've been able to eke out a living doing this and getting the joy and satisfaction I get out of it. Also, of course, there's been a lot of stress that goes along with it all. But overall, I'm very pleased with what I've done with my life, and I hope I can continue to do it as long as possible.
Well, once again, really enjoyed it, and I hope that you'll stay in touch with us. And
I will. I have a lot of your podcasts to catch up on.
Yeah, I think 57 or 58. Maybe this will be episode. I
just subscribed to your show, Guitar Business Radio, and I'll be listening it in the car as I go to work.
That's awesome. Well, I really, really, once again, appreciate it, Roger, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
So what did you think of the interview with Roger Sadowski? We always want to hear from you, and you can do that easily through the official episode page on our website at guitarbusinessradio.com, or on Facebook and Twitter at Guitar Business, or email us directly at contact@guitarbusinessradio.com. And of course, if none of that works for you, just call us on our GBR hotline at 888-777-2404. You can do that right now if you like, or later. Operators are back to work and standing by once again, so give them a call. They could use some encouragement. So that was definitely an interesting interview for me because I learned a lot of things from Roger that I didn't know about Sadowski guitars. Like I said in the interview, I became aware of Sadowsky primarily because of their electric nylon string guitar from back in the 90s. And truthfully, that impression had stuck with me for all these years, even though I'd seen ads and other info about the company that certainly might have suggested that, as Roger said, what they're really known for in large part is their basses. So that caused me to think a little bit about it. Like, how did I not know that naturally? But then again, I can't beat myself up over it. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of noise out there. There's way more information out there than all of us combined can ever take in. So all I can say is, once again, I've had a chance to get a deeper understanding of something I had pretty much the wrong impression of. Now, certainly in this case, it wasn't necessarily a bad impression at all. And even though I always knew that Sadowsky made other kinds of instruments, I generally thought of them as the company that made these cool electric nylon string guitars. But that experience also reminded me that it can go the other way just as well. We can develop impressions of people or companies, products that are based on limited information, something we heard or saw, something that didn't seem right to us in some way, and we ended up forming a negative opinion that stuck with us. And look, while there are plenty of times when our gut instinct on a small piece of information turns out to be right on a larger scale, there may be just as many situations where we've taken something out of context and completely missed the larger picture. Often when this happens, we may start to write a novel in our head that's based almost entirely on a false premise we developed from a piece of information out of context. We have all done this. Think about it. Think about the last time you did this yourself. We can create tremendous anxiety and discomfort around the false novel, and if we're not careful, we'll make decisions and say things and do things in response that end up backfiring on us because they were based on the wrong premise. Here's an example, and I bet many of you have experienced this. You've reached out to someone for any one of a number of reasons. It could be sales related, could be relationship related, anything. But you're not getting any response. Nothing. You can't get any feedback on your outreach. So eventually you start writing the novel and often manufacture a negative scenario. And at what point do you begin to react negatively in some way or another? Now, for you Seinfeld fans out there, you may remember the episode where George is trying to fix a situation with a woman he dated with a phone call. I forget some of the details, but she's not there, so he leaves a message, which ultimately he's not pleased with, but he waits for a response. Nothing. So he calls back and leaves another worse message, clearly irritated. No response. And eventually there are several additional phone messages, each worse than the next. It's hilarious. But then out of the blue, he finds out that the woman was away on a trip or something and out of touch and had not heard any of the terrible messages. So he hatches this plan with Jerry to somehow replace the tape in her answering machine with a blank so she wouldn't hear them and all would be well. And they managed to pull that scheme off successfully. But in the end, George finds out that the woman had actually called in earlier and got all the messages and had erased the original tape. So as it turns out, she ultimately informed George that she thought the messages were hysterically funny. And so the story ends. More often, though, that kind of story doesn't end so well. So what's the moral here? Well, be careful when jumping to conclusions when you don't have all the information. Especially exercise extreme caution when you take any action in these kinds of situations, at least until you have a complete picture and the right amount of details. And one of the ways that you can do that is, yep, you guessed it, stay positive. Stay focused on your destination or destinations, but remember to keep all your options open on how you're going to get there. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again on episode 60. And that's it for this episode of Guitar Business Radio. Thanks for being with us. You can stay tuned and stay in touch at guitarbusinessradio.com.